Thank you, Joel, for that introduction, and let me just say that you have my undying gratitude for sparing them any of the number of embarrassing stories you could tell from when I was a resident at CHOP. And I'd also like to begin by thanking Martha and Jane for the opportunity to be part of this important summit. It really is an honor and a pleasure to be here. It's an honor and pleasure just to follow Dr. Anda. I would suggest, and I think you'd all agree with me, that we could change that label from troublemaker to visionary. This is actually the second chance that I've had to speak after him. You'd think I'd learned the first time, not to try and follow up after him. But for me personally, this is just awesome, right? I mean, it doesn't get any better than this for me because my passion is toxic stress. And as you're about to hear, the story of toxic stress really begins and ends with the ACE data. So for me, the ACE study really is alpha and omega, right? I think to have 2 days to really talk about this, I'm just in seventh heaven. So what I'd like to do today is to attempt to put some letters between alpha and omega to try and talk about some of the basic general science that goes behind these letters, because I think these advances in basic developmental science and the ACE data together really are forcing us to reconsider the childhood origins of lifelong health and disease. And they're challenging us as pediatricians and as educators and as advocates to do a better job of getting things right the first time instead of trying to repair things down the line, the prevention theme that Dr. Anna just mentioned. Now, as a primary care pediatrician, I will be the first to acknowledge that change is hard, right? So I have no illusions that translating the science into policy and practices is going to be easy. In fact, I would argue it's going to be a tremendous challenge, requiring sort of unprecedented levels of collaboration and silo busting. But what I hope to convince you in the next hour or so, it's also a tremendous opportunity. I'd also like to point out that my subtitle here sort of has two different meanings. There's realizing the potential in the sense of understanding, and I should say that the subtitle really was realizing the potential of a shared vision. And I'll get to the vision part in a second. But you can think of realizing in terms of understanding and recognition, right? That's one sort of realizing, to become aware. And to that extent, I'm sort of preaching to the choir today. I think everyone's here because we realize this. But my marching orders from Martha were to make sure that we're all on the same page. So forgive me if I'm being redundant, but I'm trying to set the stage. There's also realizing, though, in the sense of making it happen, coming to fruition, making it concrete. And I think that's a much larger goal, one that I'm not going to accomplish in an hour, but one that together, hopefully, we can have a pathway forward coming out of this conference. Good. So how am I going to do that? Well, I have three objectives for today. The first is to provide a very general overview of advances in developmental science. And because of time limitations, what I'm really going to be giving you is the 30,000-foot perspective, right? We're not going to get into a lot of detail, but hopefully we can see how the pieces start to fit together. I'd also like to present an organizing, integrated eco-biodevelopmental framework. The thought behind this framework is it's hopefully going to facilitate this translation of science into policy and practice and perhaps serve as a lens. I like this visioning perspective, a lens that will allow us to try and focus and prioritize our efforts. And then, there we go, sorry, to discuss a public health approach towards the prevention of toxic stress and its lifelong consequences. So this is sort of getting at that second form of realization there. So, I know you've been sitting for a while, and it's a nice time for a mid-morning nap. So I'm also going to be peppering my talk with 6 critical concepts. And the first one is this one: childhood adversity has lifelong consequences. Significant adversity in childhood is strongly associated with unhealthy lifestyles and poor health decades later. So this is usually in my talk where I start talking about the ACE study. So I don't have to tell you all about that because we all know about that. But I would point out a couple things. The first, Dr. Anda mentioned, is that the ACEs are really very common. And the second, though, is even though I love the ACE study and I love the ACE score, we have to acknowledge that the ACE score really is a poor measure of trauma, no offense, for a couple of reasons. First of all, we're looking retrospectively, right? We're recalling things. The second is it's still a poor measure of trauma because of repetition in terms of the ACE score itself. If you had one horrible episode versus 20 horrible episodes, it's still 1 point. And then also there's the issue in terms of redundancy. So if mom used heroin and your dad was using marijuana, it's still 1 point for household substance abuse. So I don't think that takes away from the ACE study. I think that strengthens it because we're minimizing the trauma and we still see these outcomes. So the other thing I would say is that it's important to think about all of these outcomes that the ACE study is associated with. So let's see if we get the next page. So This is a little overwhelming, and I should say right from the start that, all of these outcomes, of course, are associated with the ACEs in a dose-dependent and statistically significant manner. So the higher your score, the higher the risk for these numerous outcomes. And so it's a little easy to be overwhelmed, right? But I actually look at this and I see potential for a couple reasons. First of all, ACEs are not destiny. When I give talks, it's not uncommon for people to say, wait a second, if I had adversity as childhood, does that mean that I'm doomed? I'm doomed for bad outcomes. That's not the point. Of course not. We're talking about risks here. And they'll say, if my child had an adverse experience, are they doomed? No, it's not about, determinism. It's about trying to understand the biological underpinnings between adversity and bad outcomes. Because if we can understand those outcomes, we can make some better interventions. So let's say, for example, you're Kathleen Sebelius, and so now you're Director of Health and Human Services. Presumably, you'd like to take a bite out of all of these outcomes, right? And if you can begin to understand the biological underpinnings of the associations between childhood adversity and all these outcomes, that's an opportunity. So I see this slide, and I don't see overwhelmingness and gloom, doom, and despair. I see opportunity, right? And it gets even better if you consider these, I think of them as big five. I sort of lump illicit drugs and IV drugs into substance abuse. But if you think about smoking, alcoholism, promiscuity, obesity, and substance abuse, what you start realizing is that many of these other outcomes are related to those, right? So if you're smoking, you're going to have problems with lung disease. And if you're an alcoholic, you're going to have problems with liver disease. And if you're obese, you're going to have cardiovascular disease. Dr. Anna is going to be the first to point out that even if you take away those, you're still left with an increased risk. So, for example, if you had a high ACE score, you're still going to have risk of lung disease even if you weren't a smoker. So that's evidence what we would call allostatic loading, right? The physiologists like to talk about allostatic loading, that the body's attempt to try and turn off the stress response adds up over time. So there is evidence in the ACE study, I would say, for allostatic loading, but there also is strong evidence, I would say, for what we call behavioral allostasis. Behavioral allostasis, which is the attempt to try and turn that stress response off, behavioral attempts. So if you look at these big five, I think of them, smoking, alcohol, promiscuity, obesity, and substance abuse, what do they all have in common? And some of the adolescent folks will say, well, you add rock and roll, you have adolescence, right? but what they all are is they're maladaptive ways of turning off the stress response. They may be very adaptive in the short run, but in the long term, they're not very helpful. They can cause more problems. So how do we pull all this together? So we've developed this model where you begin with the early childhood ecology. And by ecology, I'm talking about the social, the physical environment. And we know through the ACE study that strongly associates then with lifelong developmental outcomes in learning, behavior, and health. And so the issue, of course, is that how do you begin to understand the mechanisms underlying these well-established associations? And the ACE study brings it all together very nicely, and that's why it's so magnificent. But there are lots of other data out there that show that adversity in childhood leads to bad outcomes. But how do we begin to understand the mechanisms underlying those associations and start putting those letters between alpha and omega? And of course, the other issue then is to try and do that, how do you begin to measure? We were talking about, if you can't measure it, nothing gets done. How do you begin to measure an ecology? How do you wrap your arms around an ecology? This is where I think Jack Shonkoff's work comes in very handy, and his work with the National Center on Developing Child. So you can think about adversity in sort of two different ways. There's a great deal of individual variability in the perception of stress, right? So one child will hear a dog barking and think, ooh, puppy, let's play. And another hears a dog barking and is terrified, right? Now, some of that has to do with their past experience, but the point is how we define what is a stress or stressor, that's a little subjective, right? But on the other hand, if we start talking about the reaction to stress, once there's a threat that's acknowledged and now they have a reaction to it, that we know a little better and we can measure that. That's a little more objective because we know the whole cascade of hormones that happen beginning with the amygdala and going through the hypothalamic pituitary axis. We know what's happening there. All right. So what Jack would suggest is that we have sort of a taxonomy of stress, of positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. And the important point is that these are based on the reaction, the objective physiologic responses to stress. So positive stress, it's brief, and it's infrequent, and it's in moderate intensity, and it's the normal things that kids experience. Things like an inability of a 15-month-old to express their desires, the 2-year-old who stumbles while running, beginning school or child care, and the beginning of a project in middle school. I use the middle school one because I have a middle schooler. So the point with all of these, though, is that there are social emotional buffers that allow that physiologic response to return to baseline. So it's brief, right? So some examples there would be responding to nonverbal cues, offering consolation to the 2-year-old who stumbles, reassurance that you're going to come back at the end of the day, and then for the middle schooler, even breaking up the big project into little bit sizes that you can handle that makes it a little less stressful, right? So the point here about positive stress is that it builds motivation and resiliency, and it's really important to acknowledge that positive stress is not the absence of stress. We don't want to put our kids in a bubble. We want to build resilience, right? So stress can be positive. And if you want to think about it, if you plot increasing stress on the x-axis, just about any measure you want of performance on the y-axis, you get an upside-down U, right? Whether it's immune function, cognitive function, a little bit of stress is a good thing, but if you too much, it's a bad thing, right? And so positive stress I would think of as sort of going up the curve, right? All right. So, as you might expect, toxic stress is sort of the other end of the spectrum. It's long-lasting, frequent, or strong in intensity. And the ACEs are good examples of things that potentially can precipitate toxic stress because there may not be sufficient levels of social emotional buffering. And as a consequence, we have potentially permanent changes in long-term effects through 2 at least biologically related but conceptually distinct mechanisms. And those are my next 2 critical concepts. The first is epigenetics. So epigenetics is really, it means, of course, above the genome, and it's part of really what's a revolution that's happening now in genetics. I think when we think of genetics, we tend to think of something very static, and so we tend to think of something like the Huntington's disease model, whereas you've got that gene, you're getting that disease, and it's destiny, and it's bad. And the reality is that the genome is much more like a complicated set of switches, right? And some of these switches are actually master switches that turn on other genes downstream. So you have cascades that happen because of it. And the beauty is that many of these switches are regulated by the environment. And some of these are very dynamic, on and off, and very frequent changes in the switches, and some of them are very permanent, lasting intergenerational changes. So epigenetics then helps us understand which genes are turned on and off when and where. We have effects now of the ecology in terms of determining how the genetic blueprint is read and utilized. We have ecological effects then at the molecular level, and we know that many of these, they call them epigenetic marks, are related to stress. So there's stress-induced changes in gene expression. So this has led to the aphorism that genes may load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. So pardon my violent analogy, but the point is that the genes may predispose you, but so let's say you inherit a gene that makes you likely to become an alcoholic. But if the environment never turns that gene on, that's not much of a risk, right? So one of the things that the epigenetics leadership workgroup at the Academy is trying to do is to push this sort of phrase, epigenetics, not your parents' genome, right? So it sort of gets at the fact that just because you inherit your parents' genes doesn't mean that your genome is acting the same way, right? And so this is very empowering, I think, right? So the way the analogy I like to make is that just because you understand a neuron doesn't mean you understand the brain. And just because you understand a gene doesn't mean you understand the genome, because there's a higher level of organization there in terms of how they interact. It's the complicated set of switches that determines your fate as well, even at the cellular level. What determines the difference between an eye cell versus a hair cell? It's the complicated set of switches that are turned on in that cell, what parts of the genome are being read, and that, to a certain extent, is being influenced by the environment. So, how do we incorporate this into a model? We could say that through epigenetic mechanisms, the early childhood ecology becomes biologically embedded and influences how and which genes are used. All right, so what about neuroscience? Well, we know that brain architecture is experience dependent, right? That individual connections and synapses and then complex circuits or connections or pathways are both dependent upon activity, what's happening in the environment. We have ecological effects then in terms of how the brain architecture is formed initially and then remodeled. And when we start talking about the remodeling of the brain, what we're talking about is plasticity. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. When we talk about the fact that plasticity diminishes over time, so that makes it a lot harder to remediate things down the line. We got to get things right the first time, right? And we know that early childhood adversity can trigger a vicious cycle of toxic stress, and this relates to the fact that there's asynchronous or differential maturation of different structures and functions within the brain. We'll talk about that in a second too. So as a result, we have potentially permanent alterations in brain architecture and functioning based on what happens early in life. So let's talk about plasticity for a second. There's sort of two different forms of plasticity. There's synaptic plasticity and cellular plasticity. And I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I still have trouble remembering the two of them. And so I highlighted the S and the C there to remind me that when we're talking about synaptic plasticity, we're talking about variations in the strength of individual connections. It's like taking one synapse, one connection, and turning it from a whisper to a shout. And the good news is synaptic plasticity is lifelong. So it's how old dogs like me can learn new tricks. So that's good news that we have synaptic plasticity that's lifelong. On the other hand, cellular plasticity is a little different. Cellular plasticity is variations in the number or the count of connections, right? So that's much more dramatic, right? Because that's like taking one person shouting to a stadium shouting. So you can see it's much more powerful. The problem, though, is that cellular plasticity is declining dramatically with age, and it's waning by the time kids hit school. That doesn't mean everything's etched in stone. Certainly schools play an important role, but we do need to continue to go upstream, I think. And I should also mention, though, that even though it's waning by 5, overall, different structures of the brain mature at different rates. So let's talk about, and there are some parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, where there's ongoing cellular plasticity. So let's talk a little bit about different structures in the brain, and I'm sorry, you can't have a neuroscience give a talk without having one picture of the brain. So, so let's just briefly go through this. One of the beauties of being a pediatrician, though, is that I can literally watch brain development happen as I'm watching a child development, right? So if you think about it, when they're first born, what do they have going for them? Well, they got their vital functions. They're swallowing, they're breathing. That's a good thing. And as a consequence, you might suspect, and it's true, that the brainstem, the cranial nerves, those are pretty mature. Structurally, they look pretty mature when they're born. The cerebellum we're going to gloss over because no one understands the cerebellum. But basically, the cerebellum begins maturation early and finishes it very late. But we used to think the cerebellum was mainly involved just in the coordination of movements and making movements fine. But it turns out it also is thought to play a role in other sorts of planning. But ignoring the cerebellum, going then next to the occipital lobe, the next thing that happens, what they do is start tracking. They start responding to visual stimuli. And then, if we're lucky, then we're going to get a social smile and the integration of sensory data and movement. And then, you know what happens around 15 months? We start getting tantrums, right? So now the limbic system comes on board. And if we're really lucky, very shortly thereafter, we'll have the temporal lobe coming on board. So use your words, right? And then if we're very, very fortunate, we have the frontal lobes coming on board. And so the frontal lobes have been thought of as being the seat of civilization, right? Because it's what sets us apart. It's the ability to think abstractly, to do reasoning, to do judgment, to planning. It's what we all want for our adolescence, right? All right, so the point is that these different parts of the brain come online at different times. And so I'd like to highlight just two structures for you. The first is the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system that's tucked up inside there. And I sort of think of the amygdala as the gas pedal. Or Nike had an advertising scheme a while ago about just do it, right? That's the amygdala, just do it. Right? There's no thought, it's reflexive. It actually is what keeps you safe, though. So if you've ever been walking in the forest and jumped and then realized, oh no, that was just a snake, before you even realized it was just a stick, but you thought it was a snake, you didn't have time to process that. You just jumped and did it. That's the amygdala. It's keeping you safe. Just do it, right? But then there's another part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, with some help with the hippocampus, which I sort of think of as the brake, right? We got other options. Let's stop. Let's think about this. We got other options, right? So just to contrast the two of these then. Yeah, so prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, you can think of the prefrontal cortex as being sort of cold cognition. And the amygdala, that's hot. Prefrontal cortex is judgmental. The amygdala is emotional. It's reflective versus reactive. It's calculating versus impulsive. It's think about it versus just do it. But here's the kicker. The prefrontal cortex isn't biologically structurally mature until you're 24, and the amygdala is biologically and structurally mature by the time you're 18. And we think that this delay is happening all through development, so that the on switch is maturing before the off switch. The amygdala is screaming while the prefrontal cortex is still finding its voice, right? And this sort of makes sense if you work with adolescents. You know, they make great decisions when they're cool, calm, and collected, right? So you can't take away their rights and say they can't make decisions. They can make great decisions when they're cool, calm, and collected. But if there is any twinge of emotion involved, all bets are off, right? Which is why we have graduated driving licenses and that sort of thing. All right, so a couple things to take away from this, and I have to make this clear. Dr. Ginsburg won't talk to me tomorrow. It's never too late to help youth, right? It's never too late. The prefrontal cortex isn't finished developing until you're 24, so it's never too late to help adolescents. And the other thing I would say from this slide is you can see that if things are really out of balance, there's sort of two different ways of trying to level things off. We can try and decrease the input of the amygdala and decrease stress, or we can try and increase the role of the prefrontal cortex and increase those executive functions that it subserves. And the beauty is social emotional skills do both. They do both, right? They help you turn off stress, and they demand that you learn skills to understand what the other person's thinking, what could it be, how it's appropriate to respond, right? All right. The next thing I would say is it sort of makes sense, though, that development would happen this way, because if you don't have the shoot first and ask questions later initially, there may not be a later, right? So you want to have the amygdala kicking in first so that you learn some experience to know who you can trust and who you can't trust, right? But as a consequence, you can also see that kids are really sort of biologically predisposed to stress in the sense that they have a hard time turning it off. So let's think about this for a second. If you have some childhood stress, and because of the differential maturation of the brain, that the on switch is screaming while the off switch is still finding its voice, you can see you can sort of have a chronic flight or fright response. And because of then the plasticity of the brain, that can result in changes in brain architecture. So we know if you look at the amygdalas of Romanian orphanages, their amygdalas are bigger. They are literally bigger because they're being used more. So you need to think about the brain as sort of being a muscle. The parts that you use get stronger over time. So that as a consequence, we have a hyper-responsive stress response. It's harder to calm and to cope, and that leads to what? Toxic stress. Right? So you can see how precipitants in childhood can lead to potentially long-term consequences. So how do we incorporate this into our model? We would say that declining plasticity in developing brain results in potentially permanent alterations in brain functioning and development. And if you put this all together, we could say that the ecology becomes biology, and together they drive development across the lifespan, right? So this is the eco-biodevelopmental framework, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, but you can see in the center here, this is what Julius Richmond realized 40 years ago, right? This is the basic science of pediatrics, right? He said that development is the basic science of pediatrics, right? I think you could also argue that the center here is really the science of early brain and child development. And yes, it's informed by epigenetics and the physiology of stress and neuroscience and even ACEs, like we were just talking about, but it has implications, many, many implications, not just in health, which is what I tend to think about, but also in terms of education and economics. So we have one science with many, many implications, right? And I think that's why we're all here today. We realize that, right? So the issue then is the second realization of my title. How do we make the realization? How do we make it real? How do we translate these game-changing advances in developmental science into effective policies and practices for children, for families with children to improve education, health, and lifelong productivity? That's why we're here today. How do we do that? I like to think it begins with this eco-biodevelopmental framework, and I'd like to share a few advantages of it with you. Just like Dr. Anda was saying, we need something that's simplistic to get the word out there. I like to think that this is one potential way of doing it, because even though it's grounded in developmental science, the simplicity may promote an understanding for the translation. Because as advocates for children, we're always talking about, well, you know, investments in kids, it's the right thing to do ethically, right? And now we have lots of work from Heckman and others that say investments in children is the right thing to do economically, right? But now we can say, investments in children, that's the right thing to do biologically. To build brains, to build healthy genomes, we need to make investments in kids. Right. So the other advantage of this eco-biodevelopmental framework is it sort of gets away from what we were all sort of taught in medical school and other schools in terms of the biopsychosocial, right? Because the biology is really, really important, and then we got this psychosocial stuff, I'm not really sure how it fits in, right? This would argue that psychosocial stressors and other salient features of the ecology are every bit as biological as nutrition or lead, right? There's no distinction here between mental and physical health. It's just healthy versus unhealthy development. It also emphasized the dimension of time, because if you talk to the adult docs, internal medicine docs, they're looking here, they're not looking back, right? And we need to see the cumulative, ongoing nature of benefits and threats to health and wellness. Where you are today is a product of what's happened in the past. So let's just talk about that for a second. So development results from an ongoing and reiterative and cumulative dance between nurture and nature. It's not nurture versus nature. We know that now, right? It's nurture dancing with nature. And so we have early experiences. I don't know if this doesn't have a pointer, but if we know we have early experiences that in turn alter the way the genome is read. We talked about that, as well as alter the way the brain structure, the brain forms, as well as functions, and that in turn leads to behavior. But we also know that behavior then in turn affects the next experience. So there's an ongoing reiterative dance here. The question is, whether those early experiences are protective and personal and leading to adaptive and healthy coping styles, or whether they're insecure and impersonal and lead to maladaptive and unhealthy coping styles. All right, so advantages of an eco-biodimensional framework, part 2. It underscores the need to improve the early childhood ecology if we have any hope of mitigating the biological underpinnings of disparities, and if we have any hope of improving developmental life course trajectories, we need to focus on the ecology. The problem is, how do you change an ecology, right? I would submit that there's not going to be a silver bullet, right? That it really is about community approaches, because each community is going to have its own issues to deal with, its own resources to deal with. We really need a public health approach, and that's going to require unprecedented levels of collaboration. I'm going to get to this at the end if there's time. I'll talk fast. And then it also highlights this pivotal role of toxic stress, because it's not just a matter of step on the gas or enrichment, which tends to be the education model. It's not just leapfrogs for everyone, right? I mean, certainly we need to make sure that we're stimulating kids, right? But we also need to take the brake off by treating, mitigating, or immunizing against toxic stress. And so you may not be surprised to hear that this is not a new idea, right? This idea of releasing the brake on development. So Maria Montessori, who's well known for her educational pursuits, was actually the first female pediatrician in Italy, and her assignment was to work with severely disabled kids. And what she realized is, even though they were severely disabled, they still had an intrinsic drive to master. Even if it was just dropping a pencil, they would do it until they mastered it, and then would move on to something else, right? And so this is a quote from Maria Montessori. "We discovered that education is not something that the teacher does, but that it is a natural process which develops spontaneously in the human being." And so her role then was that the teachers, her vision was that teachers then were to set up the environment in a way to allow this to unfold, to release this developmental drive. So that was in the beginning of the 1900s. Let's jump forward then to like 1940s, and then Abraham Maslow. So you may be familiar with Maslow's theory of needs and motivation. What Maslow said was, and this is another quote, that all the evidence that we have indicates that it is reasonable to assume in practically every human being, and certainly in almost every newborn baby, that there is an active will toward health, an impulse towards growth or towards the actualization. So when Maslow was talking about actualization, what he was talking about is what every parent wants for the kid, right? And we're going to talk about that in a second, but the point is there was an intrinsic drive to master, to understand. So let's see if I can get the next slide here. Yeah. So Maslow's self-actualization was this need to know, to explore, to understand. But what he realized was it's really, really hard for that drive to manifest itself if there aren't other needs being met. So he talked about the fact that we had physiologic drives, that was the most basic, that you need to satisfy the need for hunger, thirst, and sleep. And then there was a safety and security drive. We needed to feel secure and safe with danger. There was a need to be loved and belong, the need for friends, the need for attachment, for community. And there was a need for self-esteem, to achieve and to recognize. And if you had all those pieces in place, then you're going to get that self-actualization that everyone's hoping for our kids to have. So let's stop and think about that in terms of our kids today, right? So if they're coming to school and they didn't have breakfast, are they going to learn very well? Probably not, right? If there's gunshots going off outside their home and they're not secure and feeling safe, are they going to learn very well? Probably not. And if they show up to school and they don't have any attachments to any particular teachers that no one even notices whether they're there or not, they're probably not going to learn very well. And if we've cut back on the extramurals, the arts, the sports, because not every kid can thrive academically, but if we don't offer those other opportunities to succeed, are they going to be very attached to the school? Probably not, right? But let's also think about this from the parent's perspective, right? So if you're a parent and you're not sure where you're going to sleep tonight, it's hard to be the parent that you want to be, right? And if you're a parent who's being abused, has some partner violence, it's going to be really hard to be the parent you want to be, right? And If you don't have a connection because of the mobility that Dr. Anna was talking about, you're not feeling a part of a community, no, you don't have that extended family support network, it's really hard to be the parent you want to be. And if you don't have a job and an opportunity to have self-esteem, it's really hard to be the parent that you want to be. So I think the reason we talk about Maslow, some 70 years later, is that it makes sense sort of a priori. It just sort of feels right. It makes sense, but there wasn't a lot of data to go behind it until recently. And that's when the America's Promise did some research, and what they talked about are their 5 promises. And you can see the 5 promises from America's Promise match up very nicely with the 5 levels of Maslow, right? They need a healthy start, safe places, caring adults, opportunities to contribute, and an effective education. And the beauty of these 5 promises is they were able to realize that if you have 4 out of 5 of these promises met, it effectively eliminates social, economic, and racial disparities on some measures of health and education. Wow. That's impressive, right? The problem is only 1/3 of the kids in the United States actually have 4 out of 5 promises met, and a full 20% have 0 or 1%. As a society, I don't think we can afford to discard 20% of our population. And people say, well, we're not discarding, but clearly it's not a land of equal opportunity. It's going to be much harder for them to self-actualize. So I think it's sort of untenable not to give all those kids an equal shot. So the educators have also come on board. There's a group called the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development. They had a whole child education, they call it a pact for whole child education, and you can see it meshes up very nicely as well. So the point here is, I think, that unmet needs are potential sources of stress. Now, that does not mean that it's toxic stress, right? We all know that necessity is the mother of invention, right? But if we have unmitigated stress, I would argue that's the mother of destruction. So how do we put this all together? Well, we know we have childhood diversity. There's a big black box, and then we have poor outcomes. And so the question is, what's happening in the big black box? What's happening between alpha and omega? And I think I would argue that we have toxic stress that leads to epigenetic modifications, that leads to disruptions in brain architecture, that leads to behavioral allostasis, and that behavioral allostasis in turn is, in part at least, driving some of those poor outcomes. So if that's true then, if toxic stress is this missing link between the ACE exposure and poor adult outcomes, it raises 2 really big questions. First, are there ways to treat, mitigate, and immunize or prevent against the effects of toxic stress? And if so, is there a mismatch between what we know and what we're actually doing? And hopefully there'll be time, because I'd like to get to that second question if I can. So I'm going to continue to talk fast. So in terms of toxic stress, in terms of the treatment, so this is the top of the pyramid, right? We know that there are evidence-based interventions that work. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and parent-child interaction therapy are evidence-based. The problem, of course, is they're reactive, right? So the whole idea about toxic stress is that it's toxic. You want to avoid getting to that point in the first place. And we know that the efficacy of those interventions is linked to the age and the chronicity, which is probably reflecting the declining brain plasticity that we talked about. It can be costly. And good luck finding providers, right? I mean, there's just not enough providers. We know that. And there's also a fundamental issue with regard to stigma, right? People still look at all those behavioral allostasis, those attempts, those maladaptive attempts to deal with stress as character flaws as opposed to sort of biological maladaptations. All right. So what about secondary targeted preventions? The idea here is, of course, to identify a group that's at high risk, right? And then to intervene on them, right? And we have some evidence-based interventions, home visiting programs like the Nurse-Family Partnership. We are fortunate to have an administration now that's very interested in home visitation, and we have the leader, Dr. Willis, who's here today. Thank you for coming, Dr. Willis. So this is clearly an important intervention to try and target people that are at risk and intervene for them. This is obviously more likely to be effective because we're trying to minimize the damage, and we have higher returns on investment. It requires less. It requires, however, screening. You have to somehow decide what group is at risk, and once you have a screen, then you're going to have some trauma in terms of stigma, in terms of being labeled as being at risk, and we also know that no screen is perfect. It's hard to identify every kid who's at risk. All right, so what about primary sort of universal prevention? So the idea here is to be proactive and to provide universal interventions to make stress positive or tolerable instead of toxic. And the acknowledgement here is that we really aren't trying to prevent all adversity. It's sort of impossible. We don't want to put kids in a bubble. We don't want them to necessarily have no adversity. We want them to understand how to overcome it, right? We want to give them the skills. And so what we're talking about here is actively building resilience, right? And so Can we immunize through positive parenting? There's lots of data out there that parenting makes a difference. So Triple P, which is positive parenting program, is one intervention. Dr. Ginsburg likes to talk about his 7 C's. I won't say much about that because he'll be probably talking about it tomorrow. We have promoting optimism. That's Seligman's work in terms of being optimistic, right? And being hopeful, like we talked about before, right? The biology of hope. And then also, there's this thing called social emotional learning from the group, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. I'll talk about that in a second. The point here is that social emotional buffers allow that physiologic stress response to return to baseline. So we're preventing it from being toxic. And when we're talking about younger children, what we're talking about is parenting and caregiver skills, right? When we're talking about older children, then we have the potential for the schools to get involved and do what's called formalized social emotional learning. So this group, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, there are a bunch of educators and psychologists, and what they talk about is the fact that it's really important to be able to know and control your emotions, as well as to understand and manage social relationships, and to make good decisions. And when they implement interventions to do formalized social emotional learning in schools, what they found is that these can be modeled, taught, and practiced. In short, they can be learned, and when you do that, you actually improve test scores. So they were able to convince the State Board of Education in Illinois to have social emotional learning standards. So in Illinois, just like you have learning standards for reading, math, and science, there are social emotional learning standards, right? And lo and behold, when you implement this sort of thing, you actually improve test scores by 11 points in a meta-analysis, right? So social emotional skills are also known as affect regulation, non-cognitive skills, mindfulness. The point here is that they are learned. They can be modeled, nurtured, taught, practiced, and reinforced. And they effectively buffer against toxic stress by turning off that physiologic stress response. And they also increase test scores by 11 points in a meta-analysis. So I think that's very promising for older children. But I also mentioned at the beginning that cellular plasticity is declining by the time you're age 5. So what are we going to do for kids less than 5? Well, that brings us to a very uncomfortable position because now what we're really talking about is parenting, right? And as a primary care pediatrician, I have to tell you that I get really nervous when we start talking about parenting. And so the idea here is, can we promote parenting skills in those first 1,000 days, the first 3 to 5,000 days, years of life? This makes me very nervous because the last thing I want to do is to be viewed as being judgmental or condescending or culturally incompetent. On the other hand, though, there is good data out there that parenting makes a big difference. So you have cynics that will say, well, wait, parenting, this is a really bad idea because, one, our parenting skills really teachable. I mean, you either get it or you don't, right? Or there's a ceiling effect, right? So why would you have a universal invention and talk about parenting when some kids are going to do fine without that? Shouldn't we just be focusing on the kids that are at high risk? The response to that would be twofold. First of all, it's very clear now that parenting skills are teachable. They are teachable. If you look at the CD's work with Legacy for Children or Alan Mendelssohn's work with the Video Interaction Project, it's clear that we can take families and parents and teach them appropriate parenting skills and make a difference. The second thing, in terms of isn't there a ceiling effect, I understand that, and that's the problem with any universal prevention in the sense that some kids are going to do well without your intervention. So it's very hard to show your effect. So funders don't like it when you can't prove you made a difference, right? So you're going to be more inclined to look at a narrow group that's at high risk to show that your intervention makes a difference. My response to that though, is I like to make an analogy between lead and toxic stress, right? So with lead poisoning, you're going to have a hard time proving at the population level that by abating lead, you've increased IQ scores. You're not going to see that, right? That doesn't mean it's not important, right? Because it's hard to know which kids you're making a difference for. The other thing I would say about this ceiling effect issue is that, what is okay? A lot of times in the studies that we're looking at, okay is not going to jail. Okay is not dropping out of school. Okay is not being a teen parent, right? And is that really our gold standard? Is that really what we should be trying to match ourselves about? And so I have a study I'd like to share with you that came out recently from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that I think support the message that I'm trying to make. And that is, they looked at maternal support and childhood depression severity at ages 3 and 5, and then they went back at ages 7 to 13 and looked at hippocampal volumes. Now, I have to be honest, anytime a study has an outcome measure of hippocampal volumes and structure in the brain, you have to be a little skeptical, right? Because we know that structure and function don't always go together. But that being said, for our purpose today, unless you're having limbic seizures and seizures in your hippocampus, a bigger hippocampus is a better hippocampus, okay? And so what they did was, and we already know that child depression inhibits hippocampal growth. So we already know that outcome. We know that, and we even know at the molecular level how that happens, that if you are depressed as a child, that is going to inhibit the hippocampal volume. But the interesting thing about this study, though, was they also then looked at maternal support. So how do you measure maternal support? How do you measure maternal support? So they took a variation on our marshmallow test, right? So basically they had dyads that would go into a waiting room, usually a mother and a child, and there would be a brightly colored gift there, and the kid's like, woo, right? And then they're like, look, you can have that, you can open the present, and you can have what's inside if you can wait for 8 minutes. So that's sort of just the Marshall test, but they had a variation. The tweak was they stressed the mom as well, and they said, hey, in the next 8 minutes, you need to fill out all these forms, right? And so you got the kids going, oh, I want the present, and the mom's like, I got to fill out these forms. And so what they looked at is, well, did mom do anything to acknowledge the child's stress? Was there any acknowledgement, any attunement to the child's stress? You can do this, honey, sit on your hands, let's sing a song, help me with these pictures. They do anything to acknowledge the child's stress, and then they went back again and looked at hippocampal volume. So I'm sorry for showing data, but we can get through this, okay? So if you look at the gold box down here, these are kids that were depressed and had low maternal support, and as you might suspect, they had the smallest hippocampal volumes. We knew that going in. Okay. So then if you look at kids that were depressed, but they had high maternal support, it wasn't statistically significant, but it was definitely a trend if we're looking at that red box, right? The red box, bigger hippocampal volumes, right? So this is potentially some evidence for secondary interventions, right? So if we can identify kids that are at risk for depression and give some maternal support, maybe we can help those kids, right? So the red box, that's pretty encouraging, right? But now let's look at the green box. These are kids who are not depressed, but they had low maternal support and did almost as poorly as the kids who were depressed. Now, as a pediatrician, I find this scary, right? Because there's data out there that 80% of the pediatricians in the country feel that the identification of depression is our job. We may not feel qualified to treat it, but identifying it, we should do that. But the question is, how many of us as pediatricians are comfortable identifying low maternal support? Right? So the point here, and of course then the blue boxes really should be gold. The blue boxes are gold standard. If we have low depression and we have high maternal support, those had the biggest hippocampus. So the authors said that early maternal support exerts a positive influence on hippocampal development, and the positive effect of maternal support on hippocampal volumes was greatest in non-depressed kids. I think this is a call for universal interventions, right? All right. So critical concept number 6, you'll be happy this is the last one. For young children, parent and caregiver support is critical. It turns off the physiologic stress response by addressing the physiologic and safety needs. It turns off the stress response by promoting relationships and attachment, and it encourages foundational coping skills as they emerge. That's basically what Maslow's talking about, to build self-esteem and to build skills. So the point here is that early childhood professionals, whether it's pediatricians, Head Start, otherwise, we're ideally placed to promote this sort of purposeful parenting and to advocate for a public health approach to toxic stress. So what would a public health approach to toxic stress look like? Well, it would start with, and this is basically the pyramid upside down, because we got to be different, right? We don't have a pyramid, we have safety nets, okay? So the universal primary preventions would be anticipatory guidance, providing consistent messaging. And there's an evidence-based intervention that goes along with that called the communities that care. So communities that care uses what's called a social development approach, and it's primarily working with adolescents, where if they basically carpet bomb, I apologize for the violent analogy again, the entire community with the same message, right? So whether or not it's in school, the faith communities, the rec leagues, you're getting the same message about, say, truancy or substance abuse or violence, it's been shown to make a difference, right? So messaging is critically important. The beauty of this approach is there's no identification, there's no stigma, but we do have issues with ceiling effects, which in turn results in limited evidence-based and trouble with funders. But like the analogy with lead poisoning, I think it still is an important base of the pyramid, or the first safety net. But for kids that fall through that, then we have targeted interventions for those that are high risk. Again, early intervention programs, home visiting programs, parenting programs, there's less of a ceiling here, and so there's more evidence that these make a difference, but they require some screening, and then there's issues with stigma. And for the kids that fall through that, then we need to have evidence-based treatments for the symptomatic, the parent-child interaction therapy, the cognitive behavioral therapy, and the beauty here is that treatment works. We know that. It's not, adversity is not destiny, but there are issues with screening, stigma, and access. So this, I think, is what we're trying to get at. The question is, how many people think this is the way it looks right now? I don't think so. I would argue it looks more like this. They're actually doing very poor messaging in terms of parenting and universal preventions. And the kids that fall through the cracks, then we're trying to do targeted interventions. And for kids that fall through those cracks, we're trying to do evidence-based treatments. And because our kids still falling through the cracks, we're saying we need more child-enlisted psychiatrists and we need a lot better antipsychotics, right? Okay, so how do we start turning this the other way around? Well, I think in terms of universal primary preventions, the Academy is trying to lead in terms of we have Bright Futures, we have Connected Kids. These are both chock full of anticipatory guidance. We also have a National Center on Health for Head Start, which also is a way of trying to get the messaging out. There also are mechanisms outside the Academy. There's a thing called the Circle of Security, which is helping parents understand that you can even see it in an 18-month-old running back and forth, exploring the environment and coming back. That's what they're supposed to do. I mentioned before the Video Action Project from Alan Mendelsohn. The point here is, and this is something that the Early Brain and Child Development Group's trying to push, is the idea of relationships as a vital sign. When you meet a diahead and it's not right, you get that thing in your gut, it's almost social emotional surveillance. We need to be aware of that and realize that we need to do something about it. So what we're really talking about here is decreasing stress and building skills. That's sort of the first level. Then targeted interventions, we need to screen for risks, and there are some evidence-based things that are coming out now. Howard Dubowitz's program, which is Safe Environments for Every Child, we're basically assessing the ecology and identifying and addressing major risk factors. We need to refer to and advocate for these evidence-based sort of interventions, and we also need to collaborate and work on developing new ones. So the point of the second level then is to identify risks and to provide evidence-based interventions. And then we have evidence-based treatments. We need to be screening for diagnoses. And Cindy Christian will kill me if I don't talk about the fact that we need to do a better job of identifying abuse, right? When a full quarter of kids that have been identified as having been abused had previous injuries, we're not doing very good at making that diagnosis. And then we can apply what's called a common factors approach. This is Larry Wisso's, that even if as a primary care pediatrician, I can't do cognitive behavioral therapy, I can provide some support, some encouragement, some optimism that things can get better. And then we need to refer to and advocate for evidence-based treatments, as well as assisting in the innovation of new treatments. And the thing here, of course, is we're identifying symptoms and providing evidence-based treatments. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to just actually, you know what? I think I still need to move forward a little bit more because some other things we need to talk about. We'll just go to the next slide. Nope, next slide. I faked you out. Sorry. The guy in the back, I don't actually control this. I'm telling him what to do. I faked him out there, so I apologize. So even if the medical home, and I tend to think of this in terms of the medical home being a pillar of community, even if we are integrated in the sense, vertically, in the sense that we have primary preventions in the home, we have secondary interventions in our medical home, and we have treatments in our medical home. And so I have to say, most medical homes aren't doing all this right now, right? But even if it was the ideal, just for argument's sake, we had the ideal medical home, we were doing all those things, I think you can appreciate it's not very stable. We can't do this all on our own, right? But then there are other pillars in the community, right? We've got child protection services, early intervention, child cares, we've got home visitation, and they're each doing a different thing. So, child protection, they're clearly focused on treatment, and the home visitation, they're trying to do prevention. But again, pretty unstable, right? So the question is, how do we move from pillars to pilings, right? Where we have prevention, we have interventions, we have treatment. And now that's not to say that child protection is doing prevention. They're still going to be doing treatment, but they certainly need to know who's doing prevention in the community, and they need to be advocating for those services. And likewise, home visiting may not necessarily be doing treatment, but they better be aware of it, and they better know who can do that in their community. Does that make sense? So what we're talking about is a public health approach where we're having integration both vertically in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary treatments, as well as horizontally across pillars. And it gets even stronger if we add in sort of non-traditional pillars, the juvenile justice system, the education system, right? The faith communities, the rec leagues, right? And this is sort of the communities that care model, right? That we're all giving the same message. So the beauty of this sort of approach, of course, is that we're having collaboration. It demands collaboration, but we know collaboration can be very hard without a shared vision. So one of the analogies I like to make about the ACE study, when you talk about the ACE study, and I'm guessing Dr. Ann has had this experience too, is that the way you view the ACE study really depends on your perspective, right? And so the question is, how do we develop sort of a shared vision? And I'm reminded of the Chinese proverb of three blind men coming across an elephant, right? And so the first one, he is able to feel the tail, and he says, "Oh, an elephant, it's like a straw fan," right? And the next blind man, well, he is actually hugging the leg, and he says, "No, an elephant's like a tree trunk," right? And the third one, he actually is grabbing the trunk, and he says, no, an elephant's like a snake, right? And I think that we all sort of bring our own perspectives. So if you talk to people that say, the ACE study, that's all about childhood adversity. It's all about child abuse, right? Well, actually, only 5 of the 10 are about child abuse and neglect. The other 5 were measures of household dysfunction. And that's where the next group comes in and says, well, yeah, that's right. The ACE study, it's all about parenting. It's all about parenting. Well, yeah, 5 of the 10 were measures of household dysfunction, but as I was saying before, it's really, really hard to be the parent you want to be when you've had trauma yourself and you're not having your basic needs met. So people say the ACE study, that's all about the social determinants of health. It's all about the social determinants of health. Well, I would say it's all of those, right? It's all about toxic stress, right? And so how do we develop the shared vision to move forward? And that's sort of what a purpose of today is. So now if we could jump to the end. There should have been a box there. Boop. All right, so unfortunately, I'm gonna have to go through these. I apologize. I thought that I had a box in there to jump to the end. Basically, this is just the fact that what I was talking before about the big 5 in terms of social determinants of health. One of the things that really gets at me is that this was actually recently in Science where they're talking about the non-communicable diseases. And what they said was all those things that we talk about in terms of the big 5, these behaviors, overeating, smoking, excessive alcohol consumption, physical inactivity, we recognize that these are engages that we engage in even though they're undesired consequences down the line. And so what they're arguing here is that we need to do a better job of interventions that target the automatic processes. What they're talking about here is things you do without even thinking about it. So when you get stressed, you smoke. When you get stressed, you overeat. When you get stressed, and they're saying, well, we got to target those automatic processes. But my thought is, how do those automatic processes form in the first place? When do we think it happens? Really early, really early, right? All right, so the question is, do we continue to treat disease, the unhealthy lifestyles that lead to disease, or the toxic stress that leads to the adoption of unhealthy lifestyles in the first place? So this is what the public health parable about going upstream. There was a man by a river, here's someone drowning. Being a good swimmer, he rescues that person. But as soon as he gets out, there's another and another and another. He exhausted, he begins to walk away, and he's asked where he's going. He says, I'm going upstream to prevent others from falling in, right? I think that's what we're trying to get at here, is how can we go upstream? So to summarize then, what is toxic stress? It's a physiologic stress response that is excessive or prolonged, and it reflects an inability to turn it off. It results in potentially permanent changes in gene expression, brain development, and behavior. Hello? There we go. So why should I care? Well, toxic stress is a mediator between the early childhood adversity and less than optimal outcomes in learning, behavior, and health. And if you have any question about that, I urge you to look at the work of Clancy Blair, which shows that stress is actually a mediator between poverty and poor executive function. Understanding the biology underlying these well-established associations opens up new opportunities for primary prevention and early intervention. So what do I mean by that? Well, again, if we have childhood adversity and poor outcomes, and if that's our limit of understanding, then we're really left doing advocacy to minimize adversity, which we need to keep doing. And we need to try and advocate for the health and social services to deal with the outcomes down the end, which we need to keep doing. But if we open up the box and we see that we have toxic stress, which leads in turn to maladaptive behaviors and non-communicable diseases, well, then that opens up new opportunities, because then that suggests what we really need to do is also be trying to improve caregiving community capacities to prevent or minimize toxic stress. So we may not be able to lift every child out of poverty, but can we make it less toxic by having stable and nurturing relationships that turn off that physiologic stress response? And if kids are going to have stress, can we improve caregiver and community capacities to promote the healthy and adaptive skills that they need to deal with stress? Those rudimentary but foundational social, emotional, language skills. Can we actively build resilience? All right, so what can I do? Understand this eco-biodevelopmental framework and advocate for a public health approach to address toxic stress, help children figure out how to turn off their stress in a healthy way, and intervene early for those children who are at high risk or appear unable to turn off their stress response. So I started by saying that I think that this is going to be a tremendous challenge, but hopefully I've convinced you it's also a tremendous opportunity. So when the going gets rough, let's try and remember the words of Frederick Douglass, that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. Thank you so much.